I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're standing before the gates of Drangleic as I begin the arduous task of ranking all 41 bosses in Dark Souls 2. And with that many bosses, this is a two-part series. This episode will tackle bosses 41 through 21, while next week I'll tackle my top 20. So click the card in the top right corner or check out my channel if you want to see that video after watching this one. The Dark Souls 2 base game was my first ever Souls experience way back in 2014. So even though I do feel Dark Souls 2 is one of the weaker games in the series, it holds a special place in my heart. Scholar of the First Sin, however, which is the game I'm playing for this video, does not. I'll be honest guys, with 41 bosses to get through, I could make this list multiple times and a majority of the bosses could shift dramatically outside of my top 10 and bottom 5. It's clear Dark Souls 2 went for quantity over quality, and speaking of quantity and quality, did you know only 2% of my viewers are subscribed to the channel? What a small quantity for such good quality videos, am I right? Let's rectify that. I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023, and you can help, so parry that subscribe button, and let's get on with the show. My top 41 Dark Souls 2 bosses, ranked, and be sure to tell me your least favorite bosses down below. The only boss in Soulsborne history to cause me genuine mental anguish many moons ago, Lud and Zalin, the King's Pets, are the optional boss of the Burnt Ivory King DLC, hidden at the end of Reindeer Fuckland, and spoilers for my area rankings, my least favorite area in any Soulsborne game. I still remember my first time beating them. I was using a dexterity build and struggling to even make a dent, even with buffs. It really does feel like if you're not using a big strength weapon in Dark Souls 2, you've got no legs to stand on. And for this playthrough, I learned my lesson. Lud and Zalin are a fairly simple fight, and one of the cats even has the kindness to wait till the other reaches low health before joining in. Their attacks are bearable, and if you have good defense or good damage, you should be able to melt the first cat just in time to face the second. But Dark Souls 2 capitalizes on all of your mistakes. Mistime a single dodge or heal at just the wrong time, and that progress is gone instantly, as these Gonyos will find a way to kill you then and there, causing that awful, awful boss run back. The cat that remains can also, just for fun, heal and buff itself if you don't kill it quickly. What the fuck? The most damning aspect of this fight, however, is that it's a reskin of an actually good 1v1 fight from this DLC. How lazy can you get? We could have had an ultimate reindeer boss that would have fit thematically with the area prior, but no. We get two reskinned cats. Two awful reskinned cats. Some of the other bosses in this list have way worse mechanics, don't get me wrong, but Lud and Zalin, they made it personal. And while this playthrough I beat them in 4 attempts, I will never forget the genuine tears from my original playthrough where I took over 8 hours trying to take these guys down. I despawned every fucking reindeer. I wasn't very good at these games back then. Tell me, how did we go from Calamite in Dark Souls 1's DLC to this? The Ancient Dragon is without a doubt the most underwhelming dragon boss in the entire series. Dragon God, you're excused, congratulations. Fun fact, I never actually killed the Ancient Dragon in any past playthroughs. I tried once or twice, died to the first fire attack because I hadn't looked up the fight prior and was like, no thanks, I didn't need that giant soul anyway. But in this recent footage playthrough, I realized I would have to bite the bullet and actually fight him. Maybe it'd be better than I remembered. Maybe people are overreacting about his bullshit one-hit kill mechanics and bare-bones moveset that doesn't take advantage of his size or his arena. And upon beating the dragon first try, my thoughts were, well, what a waste of time and data. I already touched on it, but the Ancient Dragon has one of the most predictable basic movesets on any boss, is incredibly easy to lock into a pattern, and commits the cardinal sin of not taking that much damage while being in the air for a majority of the fight. This means that yes, it's technically easy to win, but you'll be spending a good 20 minutes whittling away at its health to get that victory. Nothing is more riveting than running away every 2 seconds because its fire breath has a hitbox the size of Central Yharnam. At least the Ancient Dragon is optional and his Soul of a Giant isn't technically needed if you want to go kill Vendrick. He has cool lore though, being a false deity created by Aldia, and I still remember the days when we thought the Ancient Dragon was Aldia. Good times. Dark Souls 2 actually has one of the more interesting stories in the franchise, it's just not shown well through gameplay, and that's a shame because so many bosses would be so much better if that were the case. You know that Sith boss I kinda like from Dark Souls 1? Well, Dark Souls 2 had this thing with some of its bosses where you could see they wanted to recapture the magic. And what's cooler than a giant wolf wielding the sword of its master to protect you from falling into the abyss? A giant rat dog with 4 toxic afflicting small rat dogs in a bland featureless cavern arena! Oh wait, that's about as cool as my flaming homosexuality. That was a funny joke because cool means cold and I said flaming. Haha, that was an attempt. Just like this boss was certainly an attempt as well. Dark Souls 2 really wants to be Dark Souls 1. But who thought taking one of the best bosses from the first game and giving it rabies was a good idea? The Royal Rat Authority is bland at best, but made all the more worse by those toxic inflicting baby rats that attack you first. Rule of thumb, kill them before attacking the main boss, then hug its legs and you'll instantly win. That is, assuming Dark Souls 2's awful hitbox detection doesn't screw you over first. My question, why did there need to be 2 Royal Rat bosses in this game? Actually, you know what? Roll the transition. What do you mean I haven't filled my quota on this boss yet? Roll the damn blue and white stripes, what do I pay you for? Thank you. Was that so hard? You're fired. The Royal Rat Vanguard. The other rat boss. A swarm of the creatures designed to absolutely ravage you if you don't have good damage. I'd be fine if this was the only Royal Rat boss in the game because it actually fits the rats' personalities far better. And the one you have to kill with the Mohawk is honestly pretty cool. Love that for him. The Petrification Affliction is admittedly terrifying, but even though I had a few close shaves, I managed to avoid that fate, and the bonfire to get back into the fight is 2 steps away, so you're not losing any progress. Don't get me wrong, neither of the Royal Rat fights are actually good, I'd literally rather do almost anything else, but at least both fights are quick and painless, the exact opposite of my bottom 2 bosses. There's also a surprisingly detailed set of lore for the Rat Covenant in Dark Souls 2, which, once again, is not conveyed through any form of gameplay. But you've got to respect the Rat King. He doesn't hate humanity, he just wants to protect his kind, as humans broke an accord between the 2 species long ago. And his dream is that one day rats and humans may live and die together in peace. And judging by the amount of rats I've killed and been killed by across the Soulsborne series, he doesn't need to worry. Genuine question, why is the Dragon Rider duo a thing? The sole Dragon Rider in Hyde's Tower of Flame makes sense to an extent given his dragon was chilling outside Cathedral of the Blue, but these guys don't have dragons, and they only serve as a mid-boss for a level that doesn't need one. Take this fight out and have a hallway leading to the next bonfire, and the level pacing still runs smoothly. As soon after, you have a much better boss waiting in the wings. As it stands, the Dragon Rider duo feels like a very basic DPS check to see how far you've come in your journey. They both take a lot of damage, the ranged Dragon Rider being weaker than the normal one, but as with most gank bosses in Dark Souls 2, if you underestimate them, they can actually stunlock you into a series of hits. And because of how slow Dark Souls 2 is with just about everything, you're more likely to make a mistake in that situation. I've died to these guys before, I'll admit that. And it sucks, because if you don't find that hidden bonfire just before Nishandra's throne room, you have to run through the entire castle all over again. And the ironic thing is, the only good thing about this duo is that they give you souls when you kill them. You know, the thing that every boss does. Ouch. Do I really need to say it? Yes, it is my job. Why does this boss exist? Who looked at Brightstone Cove Seldora, infested with spiders, soldiers, and hollows, only to say, you know what we're missing? Jesus. Or your own interpretation of God, I subscribe to the doctrine of Sasha Colby myself. Whatever the case, I feel weirdly uncomfortable killing the Magus and his congregation because we basically interrupted a sermon and committed a war crime. Though with the name Prowling Magus, it's clear that there's some maliciousness about. The congregation were clearly being used, and the Prowling Magus was taking advantage of the broken state of Seldora following the ransacking of the town by Freya's spiders. That's a whole lot of lore, but that doesn't give this boss the right to exist. It's just beating up enemies that can barely put up a fight. The congregation just sits there crawling towards you, and the only danger comes from the clerics and their magic attacks. These can kill you if you're not spatially aware, but even on New Game Plus cycles, this boss doesn't hold a candle to anything else in the game. And I'm aware of that because when farming for 100% completion in Dark Souls 2 last year, I had to farm sunlight medals at the camp at the start of the Brightstone Cove, and once the enemies stopped spawning, I'd constantly have to kill the Prowling Mages and Congregation with a bonfire ascetic. Wouldn't recommend, not worth the time. You all knew the Shulva Gank squad would be somewhere in my bottom 10, or I should use their government names: Afflicted Grave Robber, Ancient Soldier Varg, and Serra the Old Explorer. At the end of the Cave of the Dead, this trio who arrived to rob the Sunken Kingdom are now its hollowed guards, stopping others from reaching the treasures beyond. And that's all the lore we have, so let's talk about the fight itself. As you probably know, all 3 optional bosses in the DLCs were designed with co-op action in mind. And as you probably know, a majority of Souls players will simply ignore that and do these areas solo. On the one hand, I can respect wanting to encourage cooperation. On the other hand, the 3 co-op areas have some of the worst mechanics, level design, and enemy placement in the entire franchise. And trust me, we'll be getting to that in my area ranking video. But to then place a trio of NPC battles at the end is just lazy. As a solo player, you have to kite them around the rather confusing layout of the room. My advice would be to kill Serra as quickly as possible to avoid any snipes, while also keeping yourself facing Varg because he has a penchant for backstabs, and with the Dragon's Tooth can one-shot just about anyone. I can see this boss being genuinely fun in co-op, and on its own, it's not a terrible fight. A bit poorly designed, a little lazy for an optional boss you're paying money for, but it doesn't fill me with intense rage. I know the fanbase absolutely despises this trio, and I get it, believe me, but at least once you know the right path through Cave of the Dead, the boss run back isn't trauma-inducing. Still awful, but it's no Frigid Outskirts or Iron Passage. It's just a shame that the Gank Squad trio exists, because the Sunken King DLC has 2 bosses you won't be seeing in this video, which is a good sign. Then it has these guys. Back in my Dark Souls boss ranking video, I mentioned that my first experience with the Bell Gargoyles was actually in Dark Souls 2. So because of this, I actually experienced the Belfry Gargoyles fight on Belfry Luna as a completely original experience. And I was frustratingly excited by the challenge. Base game Dark Souls 2, these guys were hard, and they were practically required to fight because the devs left the Bastille key behind them. You know, that key that lets you access the torches to light up the Lost Sinners room? In Scholar of the First Sin, they changed that, but my old memories still remain. On this most recent playthrough, the luster of the gargoyles, though, has worn off, as you can see from the very low placement on this list. I love the gargoyles, I always will, but with the context of them being reused assets, as well as the spammy nature of how there are 5 of them that will fight you all at once, it's a DPS check, but not a fun one. I just dislike the fights that so desperately try to call back to that one game you all loved so much. Look at me, I'm like Dark Souls! And to this day, we still have FromSoft trying to call back to the OG gargoyle fights to awful results. We'll be getting to Elden Ring one day. A whole 4 entries ahead of the Drangleic Castle duo, we have the first Dragon Rider fight from Hyde's Tower of Flame. An incredibly simple boss battle with an enemy that has a fairly telegraphed moveset who is more than capable of falling off his own arena. Dragon Rider survives being at the very bottom of my list though because of his easy nature, as he's potentially your first boss if you go to Hyde's Tower of Flame before the Forest of Fallen Giants. And that means he's appropriately easy so that new players can learn his mechanics. His boss arena is interactable as you're able to raise platforms around him to make it easier to not fall off yourself. His health pool could have used a small buff too, but I also may have been over-leveled because I did the forest first this playthrough, and it's very easy to level up after beating a boss or 2 in this game. That being said, Scholar of the First Sin's Dragon Rider can't be any higher on this list because this enemy gets reused multiple times outside of boss battles without a dragon, as per the logic of this game, and killing this specific boss wakes up all of the Hyde Knights in Hyde. So if you didn't go to the cathedral first, need I say more? The true first boss of Dark Souls 2, the Last Giant was my first ever introduction to a Souls boss, and suffice it to say, it was a quick introduction, greeting, and farewell, as this boss holds no real mechanical depth beyond rolling away from his stomps. 99% of the time, I have zero issues fighting the Last Giant, but when I think of first bosses from other Souls games, there's no comparison. The lackluster moveset and sheer size forces the player to look down at its feet the entire time, never getting the chance to take in the giant hole above you. It's cool when the giant rips off its own arm, that's fun, but other bosses like the Amygdala in Bloodborne did that way cooler. The Last Giant mainly survives not bottoming because of its lore, because the Last Giant is the Giant Lord from later in the game, and when it sees you, it remembers that the you from the future killed it in the past. It's that one Avengers Endgame meme of the giant saying, "You took everything from me," and your character saying, "I don't even know who you are." Imagine dying to the Last Giant though, couldn't be me. The Hollowed King of Dark Souls 2. Vendrick can be found a shadow of his former self at the end of the Undead Crypt, past his loyal bodyguard roaming in a never-ending circle. A tragic figure who fled the castle upon realizing Nishandra's true nature, his soul is locked in the Shrine of Amana, while his body hollows in the Undead Crypt. Vendrick has a unique mechanic in that depending on how many Souls of the Giants you have in your inventory, you can do more and more damage to him. Of course, he also hits like a truck in retaliation, but he has a fairly simple moveset to balance that out. If you want the easiest chance of killing him, you need to claim all 5 Giant Souls. In my first Scholar playthrough, I killed him with 4 Giant Souls because, as discussed earlier, fuck the Ancient Dragon, and I had no major issues beyond a few bad dodges, while in this playthrough, I had all 5 Souls and Vendrick was a pushover. His lore is fantastic and tragic, but when I think about this fight and all the prep that has to go into it, well, you'd think as a gay person I'd understand the pain of prep work, but even then I'm like, no thanks. I'd rather just beat Nishandra and not bother unlocking the true final boss most of the time, and if I wasn't recording footage specifically for future videos, I wouldn't have bothered killing Vendrick or dealing with the secret final boss of the game. That says it all, really. I swear I like Dark Souls 2. I just have a lot of repressed anger towards my 100% achievement playthrough last year, and this is my therapy. So, Guardian Dragon, how did you ruin my life? I'm kidding, of course. The Guardian Dragon, despite suffering from similar issues to the Ancient Dragon, at least has a more dynamic moveset, and the fight ends much quicker. The dragon guards the Dragon Aerie put in place by Aldia, and if you got any ranged attacks, the fight will probably end extremely fast. In my 2022 playthrough, I had magic and had a blast melting this dragon whenever he came close. As a melee build, it's admittedly similar to the Ancient Dragon, where you're running away from his flame attacks and waiting for the crumb of landing on the ground, a rare occasion where you can whack the dragon for a few hits before it flies into the air for another eternity. The reason why dragons like Calamite, Midir, Sin, the Elden Ring Menagerie, etc. work so well is because they actually do spend a lot of time on the ground and thus have ground movesets. The Guardian Dragon does not have a good ground moveset, and thus falls into tedium. But I love the arena, I love the aesthetic, and I love the surprise that you're fighting a dragon all of a sudden. It puts Aldia in this intimidating space where you realize, you've just walked through this guy's insane manor, and this guy kept a pet dragon. And the rest of those dark secrets, well, whew. Guardian Dragon is inoffensive, but not very fun to fight, and you know what? That's okay. I have really written myself into a corner, haven't I? Because now I have to justify why Jabba the Hutt himself, the Covetous Demon, is sitting at number 29 on my list. I'm gonna be honest here. I have no justification, I just feel like it. Perhaps it's the meme, or perhaps I just love an underdog, but a part of me actually enjoys the Covetous Demon when I go to fight it. It's not hard, you'll be fighting more against some wonky hitboxes than an actual threatening moveset, but his little rolls are endearing, and his silly little goofy face is adorable. You can even feed him with corpses from the ceiling like a little puppy. His lore is part of a classic straight couple love triangle between Mitha himself and an unknown king, and as a gay person, I live for the drama. I've seen it play out before, and I've got my popcorn at the ready. The reality is, the covetous demon should be near the bottom of my list, but because it's my list and I have a genuine affection for whatever the fuck this thing is, I just can't bear to throw him off that cliff. A few entries above his future self, the Giant Lord is interesting, to say the least. You fight this boss in a giant memory, an aspect of the endgame of Dark Souls 2 that, for lack of a better term, I'm not too keen on. How are you supposed to figure out that the giant trees and the Forest of Fallen Giants, the first main area in the game, are your endgame goal? The Giant Lord lies at the end of a memory after a fierce battle near the Pursuer arena, and sadly, he's not that different from his last giant form. The only difference is he has a sword now, which is still easily avoidable, and his legs are still easily hackable, and his health is still woefully average. This fight is entirely propped up on the lore of the giants and the aesthetic of the arena, because the mechanics themselves are just so basic. It really feels like the Dark Souls 2 devs just didn't know how to design endgame, base game bosses, because a majority of them after the Undead Crypt just aren't memorable from a gameplay perspective. I wanted to like this fight a lot more than I did, and it just feels like the giants had so much more potential, and it was never realized. But at the same time, I still feel this fight is better than those beneath it, and that leaves me with so many complicated feelings. Dark Souls 2 just is one of those games, isn't it? I love it, but I hate it at the same time. It's like a sibling. You fight, you argue, but at the end of the day, you're still family, and Dark Souls 2 is still family in the Soulsborne universe, and in my heart. The first of our 4 lords of Drangleic, the Old Iron King, is steeped in lore. Perhaps my personal favourite lore of Dark Souls 2, and we'll hear more about him as we see other bosses related to his story, but when we the player find him in-game, he is a possessed creature sunken into the lava of his keep by what lurks beneath. In other words, he's a Lord of the Rings Balrog, which means I adore his design. It may be a basic fire demon, but I am a basic bitch, and I love the simplest things. It's just a shame that the boss fight doesn't live up to the title of being one of these 4 lords. The Old Iron King is this game's Ceaseless Discharge, a better fight than Ceaseless because his moveset is a little easier to understand and he has a few more slams and fire breaths he can chuck in there, but his main issue is his speed. The boss moves at a snail's pace, like everything else in Dark Souls 2, and that makes him extremely easy to understand. His moves are telegraphed with neon signs, and the fact that the most dangerous aspect of his boss battle is a small hole in the arena says everything you need to know. Like Nito in my Dark Souls boss rankings, he ranks low because I'm just personally disappointed by his content. I expected more. I wanted more. Instead, I got an army of Alon Knights. Though it's funny how the Old Iron King, out of all the bosses he's related to in the lore, is the worst one on my list. Very on brand for an upstart who rose to power through another's actions and reaped the benefits until his demise at the hands of his smelter demon. I'm just gonna say it, I'm surprised to find the Skeleton Lord so high on my list. After all, getting to the end of Huntsman's Copse and seeing this skeletal arena behind the waterfall, only to discover it's a minion gank boss, was initially a bit of a letdown. The 3 Skeleton Lords themselves are intimidating, and I do wish they had more health and were the sole enemies. That way you could maybe upgrade their movesets a bit, make them a little faster. I'm basically asking for the Shadows of Yharnam in Dark Souls 2. But what we got wasn't terrible. Every time you kill one of the Skeleton Lords, their souls inhabit the bones around the arena, forming normal skeleton enemies you have to defeat. These can be average skeletons, slightly harder skeletons, or everybody's favorite, bone wheel skeletons. Now in base game Dark Souls 2, I think there were more bone wheel skeletons that spawned compared to Scholar, which I guess is a point in Scholar's favor, because nobody likes bone wheel skeletons, and I'll take an easier fight if it means less of them. It's a lesson in crowd control, where you have to take out one lord, then its minions, then the next lord, etc, etc. Or be like me and have a big strength build so you can just mow down skeletons regardless and make life easy for yourself. The aesthetic of the arena and the genuine simplicity of the fight appeals to me, even if I'd rather they did something a little extra here to make it truly special. At least their lore is fun. On the orders of the old Iron King, they once hunted down the undead but found themselves hollowed instead. And upon rebirth as skeletons, they founded a kingdom of bone, creating a monarchy for themselves, also creating the blueprint for Queen Elizabeth II's inevitable necromantic return in a few years when the UK eats itself alive. I salute you, Queen. I can make those jokes, I'm British. I knew I'd have to face my fear of spiders eventually. The Duke's dear Freya, a colossal arachnid of horrifying proportions. Unless you live in Australia, in which case, the Duke's dear Freya, the spider in the corner of your bedroom. I will concede that Freya is actually a fun boss. She has a varied moveset, tons of different swipes, bites, and her classic laser attack. And you have two faces you can injure her at, meaning if she's attacking with one face, run around to the other side and whack away at the other. On her own, honestly, a solid fight. But her arena is filled with kids, and it brought PTSD of the time last year where I had to look after a ton of Spanish kids at an English camp in the gorgeous mountains of northern Spain. It truly was Spain without the S. Sure, if you have a torch, or the flame butterflies to light a torch, the spiders aren't a problem, and for me that's practically a requirement to get through Brightstone Cove, because I just can't do it. I have bad arachnophobia, can't handle it. But for people who don't know that, the boss fight can be very rough. You could get killed by the minions pretty easily, and the boss run back is painful. It's giving Rom the vacuous spider vibes. I love Freya's lore, how she's being influenced by the Pale Drake's soul, proof that even in death, Sif the Scaleless is still a massive coño. The soul driving the Duke to madness, causing him to sacrifice the people of Seldora for his pet. Couldn't be me, let's just say that. We're now at the point in the list where I like all of the fights, I just prefer the rest more. If you're ripping off Dark Souls 1, clap your hands. If you're pandering to the masses, clap your hands. If you're desperate and you know it and you really want to show it, if you're lost without Miyazaki, clap your hands. Perhaps the most blatant rip-off from Dark Souls that needn't have been ripped off, taking Ornstein and plonking a dude in his armor set with dark magic into the second major area of the game is just lazy. There's that initial rush of, oh my god, Ornstein, hi! And then you realize it's not him. It's a cosplayer who has some cool moves for an early game boss. I actually like the dark lightning magic he wields, and he even has Smo's butt slam move, what a choice. But it's clear the old Dragon Slayer is made to be this callback because Dark Souls was so great, right? We must be great too because we have budget Ornstein. Can we have Dragon Slayer Ornstein, Papa from Software? We have Dragon Slayer Ornstein at home, child. I jest. The fight is actually fun, and I do enjoy it as a brief early game stop before continuing with the rest of Dark Souls 2. But when Ornstein is genuinely one of my favorite characters in this entire franchise, the boss was never going to live up to the hype, especially when in Dark Souls 3 we have Dragon Slayer Armor, who does this concept oh so much better. Another fairly controversial boss, in the sense that I've seen some people rank him highly and other people rank him lowly, the Rotten is another of the four Lord Soul Holders, hidden away past the gutter within the Black Gulch, an amalgamation of corpses strung together and reanimated, but not in a malicious way. Peer into the Rotten's lore and you'll find it's actually a compassionate entity, caring for all that was unwanted and tossed away deep within its lair. When you enter the boss battle, you even see it gently trying to fix one of its statues, only to fly into a rage when it fails and sees you. The boss itself has a relatively simple moveset, and the usual circle strafe method that works on every Dark Souls 2 boss works here as well. I like the Rotten's design. There's a puppeteering corpse on its shoulder that seemingly controls the entire body, and that's just creepy. His grab attack can be quite horrifying when you're caught by it, and the arena is just as much the enemy as the boss is. It's so easy to accidentally back into a pool of flammable oil and see your health drop drastically. Perhaps the reason I feel for the Rotten though is that you can actually cut off its limbs, and for a time, it can't even fight you. I thought this was permanent and I was playing with my food, so to speak, until right at the end of my fight it regrew its cleaver and I ended it out of fear. A great moment to be sure. The Rotten is also a fan favourite in the community for being the boss people farm with bonfire ascetics if they don't feel like collecting all the Lord's souls to pass the Shrine of Winter. So you know what? Good on you, Rotten. You may be middle of the road to me, but you've got more personality than most bosses on this list. At number 22, the Throne Watcher and Throne Defender are the weirdest placed boss in the entire game. Locked behind the King's Door underneath Drangleic, accessible via the King's Ring, you can fight this boss anytime after completing the Undead Crypt, and to nobody's surprise, they watch and defend the Throne of Want. As Vendrick never came to link the fire, the throne room grew cold and the Abyss seeped in. These two characters corrupted by the Abyss are still doing their duty to ensure that only the worthy can take the throne, and so we, the bearer of the curse, must relieve them. This feels like they were trying to recapture Ornstein and Smo, but with a more realistic pairing. I like that both bosses use different elemental abilities, with the Defender using lightning and the Watcher using magic. It's a nice dichotomy, and one is clearly more of a fighter, while the other hangs back as a powerful yet fragile glass cannon. The reason this boss doesn't quite reach my top 20 though is the revive mechanic. If you are unable to kill both bosses in a certain amount of time, one boss will revive the other, forcing you to continue the fight. I rarely think reviving a boss health bar works, except in very specific circumstances, but if you come here at the end of the game, this is just the first of 3 boss fights in a row, and if you're not careful, it can sap all your resources. I just feel it was oddly placed, and I guess it bothers me that 3 different boss fights can happen back to back in the same arena. And you know what? The last boss on today's list happens to be another Throne of Want fight. Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin. That's right, I prefer Nashandra. In terms of lore, he is the most important character in Dark Souls 2, usurping the role of antagonist from the aforementioned Nashandra, who can't exactly carry an entire game's worth of plot on her hands. That being said, of the two, I prefer her fight. I'm not a fan of bosses who have states where they can barely be damaged, and Aldia is like that most of the time when he's on fire, aside from when he teleports to a new location. It feels like an artificial way of prolonging the fight, which is ironic because most of Dark Souls 2's fights feel like they last for a few seconds. He really does feel forced into the end of the game, even if the lore makes sense, and after playing so much Dark Souls 2 with Nashandra as the final boss, it just feels weird having him there. I feel I may be alone in that regard though, and that's okay. When I'm waiting around having to dodge wood and pyromancy to win the day, it just feels a bit meh. Which is how I feel about Dark Souls 2's endgame. I don't think any of these last 3 bosses are particularly memorable, and none of them live up to the hype of final bosses like Gwyn, Soul of Cinder, Gurman, Ishin, or Radagon. There's just no comparison, which is a shame because I love Dark Souls 2 and I want to give it more praise, but from a critical perspective, and just from a pure gameplay perspective now, I don't think I jive with it anymore. That isn't to say there aren't some great bosses in the game, but that's for next week's video. I'm also ranking Aldia out of my 20 best Dark Souls 2 bosses because he's assumedly the reason we got Scholar of the First Sin edition in the first place, with the genuinely horrid enemy placement in just about every area of the game, and I am a petty bitch. Choices. That was a lot more negative than I was expecting it to be. I hope you guys aren't too offended that I'm being a little bit harsh on Dark Souls 2. I really do love this game like I love every Souls game. It's just... they don't compare. They don't compare. I'm sorry. Did I miss any bosses you think should have been in this bottom 21? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. My social links are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter. Another shout out to my patrons over on Patreon, you guys are awesome and your support means the world. And I'll see you guys next week for the finale of my top 20 Dark Souls 2 bosses, and I promise, I have hiccups, I'm not editing that out. I promise to be more positive. Adios.